WN, busy each and every day talking Orioles baseball here. Certainly the Orioles with their work cut out for them this week down in Houston and New York, where they're going to see the A-team pitching, the varsity as it were. It is quiet in football, except that the Liars Luncheon falls in the middle of the week, so we'll have our final Liars Luncheon with Ozzie Newsome, or at least we believe it to be here this week, and it's always football season here in the Charm City. Luke Jones, our intrepid Ravens reporter, joining us here during a week where you lose Ben Watson. I run down to Orlando to have a relatively benign breakfast with John Harbaugh. They're trying to, scurry up the PSL money at this point and figure out the schedule comes out probably next week or the week after. And then we're going to pick football players 3 weeks from now, Luke. So busy times in Owings Mills, even though it's not really all that busy.
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly busy. This is just one of those times where there's that little bit of a lull. Free agency, the first, second waves have come and gone. So you're at this point, and that's not to say they won't sign another free agent or two, but it becomes a little more random, a little more out of nowhere. It's far more difficult to pinpoint who exactly they're trying to target because most of the names that anyone knows, most of them are off the board at this point. Most of them have found homes. And as you mentioned, we're still 3 weeks out from the draft. And, okay, you're having some pre-draft visits and certainly having some conversations and doing your homework and putting your draft board together, but we're still not so close where that's imminent. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, but from a media standpoint, from a public standpoint, this is one of those lulls, not a dead period, because I don't want to imply that they're not doing a lot of work and they're not busy, but this is definitely one of those times where you come up for air, you look at what the Ravens have done at the wide receiver position. You look at the fact that Ben Watson is now in New Orleans, not that I was expecting him to be back, and you kind of just look around, you assess what the roster looks like at this point, as we're a few weeks out from the draft, and still talking about wide receiver. I still think that's a position they need to add to, but I think the big one at this point, at least in my mind, they need a tight end. And the problem with that now is you look at the free agent market, and I'm not enamored with anyone who's out there at this point. And we also know historically, even if you're talking about tight ends guys who went on to be a Pro Bowler, you're not finding rookie tight ends typically who come in and make an impact immediately.
Well, if you go back to last year, we go back 49 weeks. I mean, O.J. Howard was sitting there, right? And I think many of us thought that that's what the name that was going to come up on the board was going to be. I mean, literally, that's what I thought in those 2 or 3 minutes that you have there to think things through when the previous name comes off the board. And I think I was a little shocked. I know it was a big part of our conversation in the morning after that. And, here we go a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later, we'll assess every Brandon Pettigrew, right? And every tight end that sort of got away, as well as every Alan Faneca 20 years later to say the Ravens could have, might have, should have, those guys and those names were on the board. This is one of those years where I don't expect them to get a tight end at 16, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there isn't any logical slam dunk. I mean, there isn't an Eric Ebron kind of a prospect where you're talking about a guy that might be a top 10 or top 15 pick. I mean, it's really, you get to Goddard and Gesicki and those guys, they're more in that late first-round territory. I mean, if the Ravens are going to draft a tight end in the first round, the scenario to me would be they're trading back in the first round and they're taking someone at 23 or 24, whatever it would be. If it's not that, I have a tough time seeing them taking a tight end before the second round. And then you run the risk of there being a run of tight ends and you lose out on one of those top 3 or 4 guys. But, you mentioned O.J. Howard, and that was certainly something we talked about a lot last year. I mean, I don't, at this point, knowing where they are at the cornerback position and knowing what Marlon Humphrey looked like as a rookie, I think it's tough to be upset with that, and that's even speaking as a guy who's been pounding the table for drafting offensive players. But
well, you pounded the table for 4 years after the New England game, basically about getting cornerbacks. So they got one, and we're all in on it. That's cool, but there's there is some give and take here. They continue to draft on the defensive side, which we seem to talk about in the fourth week of April every year, right?
Yeah, there's no question about that. But you mentioned O.J. Howard, and just to reiterate my point, look, I think O.J. Howard's going to be a really good NFL tight end. Last year, 26 catches for 432 yards. That's what you typically see from even guys who go on to be really good starting tight ends in this league. You just don't see them do a lot as a rookie. Now,
they weaned Todd Heap here with Shannon Sharp.
I will throw in the fact that Howard caught 6 touchdowns, which certainly that skill set would do nicely for the Ravens, even as a rookie, not putting up huge numbers. But you mentioned it, Todd Heap, Dennis Pitta. I want to say Dennis Pitta had 1 catch as a rookie off the top of my head. Now was playing behind Todd Heap and Ed Dixon in the pecking order, but it just goes to show I think tight end is a very legitimate concern for this team right now. And Nick Boyle's fine as a number 2 blocking tight end. He's going to, if he gets open, he's going to catch most passes thrown his way, but he's not going to make big plays. And Max Williams was someone that they thought would be a Todd Heap type of guy. They thought he would be someone who would make plays and wasn't able to stay healthy and wasn't a great speed guy anyway, and then had that kind of that mystery knee surgery with his cartilage and everything. And you just see he can't run. He's a blocker. He's pretty decent at that. It's not as though he doesn't have some use, but clearly not a guy who has made any kind of a difference as a receiver. So at this point, it's really difficult looking at a path for them short of trading for a veteran, which is always possible, and this team has a history of doing moves like that, making moves like that. It is tough to look at that position and say, I think they're going to find someone that's going to be really impactful. It's not to say they shouldn't draft a tight end, but whether it's Goddard, whether it's Mike Gesicki from Penn State, go down the list. That's not to say I don't like those guys, but to expect any of them to make a major impact as a rookie, that'd really be bucking the historical trends that we've seen in the NFL over the last 10 or 15 years.
Well, we've talked so much about wide receiver. This is the first time we've really sort of gone on the deep dive on the tight end to say, well, if you had a tight end that was like a wide receiver, right, like the Jimmy Graham type or whatever, or that Tony Gonzalez kind of offense, that would work too, right? But on the wide receiver front here, as we get closer up on the draft, I again keep saying, are we going to wake up on May 10th and think that they're a better offense? I don't think we are, Luke. I don't know that there's anything here they're going to do that's going to feel like a heart transplant. They've already got an issue with losing Jensen, in the middle of their offensive line, which was the big problem last year. Look, Yanda coming back and playing like Yanda, I think none of us who know him and have seen the cattle prod are going to bet against him.
Right.
But I'm as worried about the offensive line as I am the unit in general, or the wide receivers, or who's going to play there, or Crabtree, who everywhere I go, people are asking me all opening day, everywhere I went. I'm standing there in an Oriole jersey, everybody's talking Crabtree with me. I think Crabtree's fine. I'm good with that. Have they gotten better since the end of the season? No, but they haven't gotten worse. And they certainly have gotten different, which I think is something you've harped on, and something that Ozzie, when he has spoken, was we're going to have fresh blood. We want different bodies. And I think part of getting rid of Watson, who could have been serviceable, is we just want different guys here. For whatever the reason, they want different human beings.
Yeah, and they love Ben Watson, the human being. But, I think certainly, and I'll go this far. I've seen a lot of people say, well, the Ravens have gotten better at wide receiver. I'm not convinced of that. I like the Crabtree signing, but let's also acknowledge he's coming off of his worst statistical season since his 2013 season, where he came back late in the season because he had an Achilles injury, much like Terrell Suggs did the first time around. And, in the spring, and he was able to come back and play, I think it was 5 or 6 games for the 49ers that year. But I'm not convinced that he's going to be an 1,100-yard receiver for them. I think he's going to help. I'd like the signing. I want to make it very clear. I think he's going to be better than what Jeremy Maclin was this past year, but I'm not convinced that that's going to be – he's going to be so good that it's going to dramatically move the meter because he is a little bit older, because he's been a guy who's never been a big speed guy. John Brown, I like the upside, but that's a really low floor too. I mean, a lot of people were so indifferent to Mike Wallace leaving, but Mike Wallace very quietly provided some really good value for them on a 2-year contract. So let's not forget that. Let's not completely be dismissive of that. That to me feels a little Torrey Smith-esque, where you say, okay, it's fine if you want to let him walk, but you better make sure you replace him. And John Brown has the upside. I like that part of it. I think he has the potential to be an upgrade there, but he's got to prove he can stay on the football field first and foremost. So the wide receiver room is different, but I'm with you. I'm not at all convinced that it's necessarily guaranteed to be better. And you mentioned center. I mean, with Ryan Jensen, that's a given. Let's not forget right tackle as well. Austin Howard, very quietly last year, was quite solid in that role, and I still don't totally get. I understand they wanted to clear $3 million in cap space, but Austin Howard was a very cheap starting solution at right tackle, and John Harbaugh's selling that James Hurst is going to go out to right tackle. I'm not buying that right now.
Well, they sell stuff like this all the time based on what's on their roster. And as Ozzie said, if we had to go play this week, we could, I guess. And this is what it would look like if they had to go play this week. Right?
Yeah, but the only thing with that is they gave James Hurst real money. I mean, and look, James Hurst, and I said this before they re-signed him, I think he's a fine, valuable backup offensive lineman. I think a guy who can play 3 or 4 spots absolutely has game day value. I mean, we've all seen those scenarios for a team when they have a couple guys go down and suddenly you're playing a tight end at offensive tackle. I mean, we've seen those nightmare scenarios, not necessarily in Baltimore, but we've seen.
Yeah, we've seen it. Eric Green, I saw Eric Green play tackle one time.
So those things can happen. So that's not to say that I don't think James Hurst has value, but here he seemed to find somewhat of a niche at left guard. He wasn't great. He wasn't. I think he was an average, kind of an average starting left guard, which is fine. You can't have Pro Bowlers at every single spot. But to re-sign him and then say you're just going to move him out to right tackle, I understand right tackle is different than left tackle, and he hasn't played there nearly as much as he has left tackle, but right tackle is a lot different than left guard, and I'm not convinced he can be the guy there. So you've opened up another hole then. In my mind, I really feel that this team, if not the first round, I feel they need to be drafting an offensive tackle over at least the first few rounds. If you're going to draft one after the, say, 3rd round, to me that's a tough sell thinking that guy's going to be ready to start for you. So definitely, and I know Harbaugh said he thinks the offensive line's in better shape than it was a year ago. John has to say that. He's not going to say that it's worse than it was a year ago. I'm not buying that whatsoever. So, long story short, they've made some changes. Yes, they still have the draft, but I also know the history of how this team has handled the draft the last 4 or 5 years. I still have some substantial concerns on this for this offense. And to your point, for anyone to ask, is this team better than it was a year ago? Right now, I'm certainly not going to say yes, it is. I'm not going to necessarily say it's worse because they have made some changes, and I like the couple signings that they have made at wide receiver. But again, there are still so many question marks on the offensive side of the ball, and I just think to the point you made, even if we're talking in early May, even if the draft has played out, and let's say they took a wide receiver, let's say they got one of these tight ends, let's say they found an offensive tackle that might have a chance to start at least at some point during the 2018 season. Again, these are still all questions. Draft prospects are great, but they're prospects, and we talk about that in baseball all the time. There's no such thing as a sure thing, even if you're picking first overall. Just ask Jamarcus Russell and so many different guys.
Tim Couch is my favorite, by the way.
Yeah. So I think from that standpoint, this is absolutely a team that on paper, going into OTAs, going into training camp, I don't think anyone's going to be, at least from an outsider perspective, I don't think anyone's going to be looking at this team and saying, yep, that looks like that's going to be a 12-win football team. And by the way, that's okay. You don't have to have those expectations from outsiders, because ultimately outsiders' opinions don't matter. But there's still very much some significant questions about this roster that I'm not sure you can just look at the draft and just say, yep, don't answer those questions there. I think some of these things are going to remain substantial questions going into OTAs and going into training camp and even going into the season, most likely.
Luke Jones joining us here. It's all brought to you by our friends at Howard Bank and, of course, our friends at Cole Roofing, who are providing sponsorship for all of our charity and community segments. We begin on Thursday. Van Brooks is going to be joining us, one of my favorite dudes from around town, and the Loyola story that I've been following from the very beginning and how he's helping the community, as well as Casey Karras. So we'll hear from them. They're partnering with Coach Billick on an event next week, so we'll be learning more about that as well. All brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing. Billy Cole's going to be here later on in the week, as well as at Howard Bank. Want to remind everybody to download the ROFO app. Let's make sure you're using that ROFO app. I have my app right here on my phone as well, and you use it. You get your gas on it. You download, and it works. And free Western fries, free chicken. I got a ROFO 2 blocks that way, 6 blocks that way. I'm always at the ROFO. I'm always gassing up there. Real fresh, real fast. Put your Cone and Blend right in your Cole Roofing mug here and get on over to Royal Farms. Let them know that we appreciate their sponsorship here at WNST. Almost went to the Royal Farms Arena on Friday night for Jimmy Buffett, but it was a long week last week. I was in Orlando for all things NFL owners meetings. We got the draft coming up in 3 weeks around here. Full coverage out at WNST.net. Luke, I was with all the coaches last week, and obviously Harbaugh, and much like what you and I saw and endured in Indianapolis, there's optimism kind of everywhere, right? And
sure,
everyone's feeling good about themselves, and then they all go into the room and they come out with this tackling rule that I don't think any of us understand any better than we do the what is a catch rule at this point. Boy, a lot of heads being scratched around the league right now after this. And I know they're trying to stay ahead of the law. They're trying to stay ahead of the lawyers. They're trying to stay ahead of the doctors and all the things that happen with CTE. But I don't know what they're doing. I don't know that they know what they're doing, quite frankly.
Yeah, it really feels like they've gotten to the point now where they've simplified the catch rule, which, by the way, I don't think is fixed, but I think there at least is a potential there for it to be better. But I feel like they've traded in that problem for now the new helmet, the lead with the helmet rule. That, to me, what's hilarious about this, and it really reminds you of big government, is they basically say, yeah, we're going to pass this, but we still have to figure out all the wording and how the replay aspect is going to work. It really does remind you of when government wants to not even talking specifically right now, but just in general, let's just pass a law, but we're not going to have this bill written for people to review until 2 hours before the vote.
We'll let you figure out how it works later. We're going to have health care and a website, except the website's going to crash, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really does make you feel like that. And look, to what you just said, I mean, there's so much about this with litigation, and I think there is some sincerity, at least some, in trying to make the game safer. And I know they've talked about concussions being up, which, by the way, I don't like that being used as evidence, because I also believe we're being more vigilant now, including players, in self-reporting. So I'm not necessarily buying that more concussions in reality are actually taking place than a few years ago. I just think it's being reported more accurately than it ever was. So when I hear that part of the argument, I'm very skeptical as far as that being good rationale for doing this. What's this going to look like? I think this feels very much like when they really started ramping up the defenseless player blows to the head and neck area, which, I'll say this, now, 6-7 years later, you certainly see fewer blows to the head on defenseless players and blows to the neck area on defenseless players. But there very much was a period of time there for a few years where there was so much gray area, so much debate, so much complaining, so many players going nuclear, like Bernard Pollard, for example, and talking about the league and how they're trying to change the game. But I just don't like the idea of, yes, we're passing this, but we haven't quite figured out what it's going to look like. To me, let's actually do some long-term thinking, long-term solution building here, and really figure out what you want this to look like. Because
this is where the World Football League in Europe would help them test stuff, right? Literally,
yeah, I mean, it's just
nobody's playing football right now outside of arena football. We'll have some brigade coverage around here, but as far as testing things and how things work, they get 4 preseason games to sort of figure that out, right?
Right, and we've seen them test. They tested the new extra point the preseason before they actually made the change to do that permanently, as far as moving the extra point back. So I guess my concern, and when I hear people talk about targeting in college football, I mean, I've seen so many examples in college football of, it's one thing to call a penalty, but then you eject a player. And there have been so many examples where I just look at it and say, well, what was this guy supposed to do? At the end of the day, these are human beings, and these are matters of physics at work in many cases. And I hate the idea. I mean, we've seen so many issues with replay, and now we want to just add more replay to the equation. I mean, my goodness, these games are going to be 4.5 hours before we know it, with the amount of reliance we want to put on replay with some of these issues, and trying to make subjective things objective. I just think it's really, really difficult. I'm not trying to be flippant about it, but at the same time, short of completely changing the game and basically eliminating the game as we know it, you're not going to eliminate concussions. You're not going to make this game completely safe. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I'm all for the idea of trying to take away the Ryan Shazier kind of hits, and you see what happened there. I mean, he was the one who ended up injuring himself. I know, going back to playing football even when I was a kid.
Well, the Kiko Alonso thing comes to mind.
Sure. I mean, there's plenty of examples, but I think from the time that you're kids who play football, and I know there aren't as many now, but when I was growing up, I started playing football around age 9 or 10. We were taught to tackle a certain way, and that was never to lead with your head. So the spirit of it, I am completely behind. But the reality of it, the application of this rule, I just think is going to be extremely problematic. And I can just see it now. And I'm just going to use C.J. Mosley as just a random example, but clearly one of the Ravens' best defensive players. Who wants to be in a position where you have this more rigid rule, and you're potentially going to even eject players, and a guy makes a hit with his shoulder, but someone else makes contact with him, and what his original target changes, and then his head, he leads with his head inadvertently, and then he gets kicked out of the game. I mean, and you might say, well, I'm trying to use a straw man's argument. No, go watch a college football season and see some of these targeting calls where guys end up getting ejected, and I don't think there was any malicious intent whatsoever. I don't know if that's good for the game. I don't know. And I'm not saying that everything needs to stay exactly the same, but I think we need to tread very carefully here as far as making such a dramatic change that you turn fans off even more than some have been turned off for a variety of reasons over the last few years, not even specifically talking about those reacting to the anthem stuff. But I think I just look at this, and I think these are the kind of things that sound great when you're talking in March and April, and you're not playing any games for the next 5 months. But I think these are the types of things that can be extremely problematic once you kick it off for real. And I think it's a really slippery slope if you're going to start, if you're going to really truly implement a targeting rule, very similar to college football, where you're going to start kicking players out of games and things of that nature. So, if you want to throw more penalties in to try to deter it, knock yourself out. But again, short of something looking just completely over the top and being malicious, I really am uneasy about what we're hearing this could potentially turn into.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke at on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. We're almost going to get a schedule here soon, right? We got mock drafts everywhere for everyone, so there's plenty of football conversation and chatter. It's not too far off here, but we're going to be playing in Nashville, playing in the former San Diego that's now Los Angeles. Right. We're going to have a bus trip down to Charlotte, hopefully, for the Carolina Panthers. So I'm excited about the schedule coming out and getting my weekend set. It's getting to be about that time right now. Right?
Yeah, we're getting there. We're definitely getting there. I think the draft will be the next big event. I mean, the Liars Luncheon we'll talk about certainly, but nothing going to be earth shattering coming from that. Although we'll hear.
We like all the players; they all look great. Every position is stacked. We can play this weekend. We can play next. I agree. I felt that way about the Harbaugh breakfast last week. I felt like I'm not getting any information anymore from any of these press conferences. I don't know. I mean, where we're going to have a Hurst play right tackle and look at you with a straight face about it, right?
Right. Well, and that could still happen, but we don't know that at this point. But yeah, I mean, you look at the schedule coming out finally starts to give you some context. I mean, we know what the schedule looks like. I mean, the Ravens, for all the talk of last year's schedule turning out to be very, very fortunate for them, and the number of backup and rookie quarterbacks that they played on paper, and of course we don't know. Matt Ryan might not be on the field when they play the Falcons in Week 13 or whatever it ends up being, but you do look at the schedule on paper, and they're going to be facing some good quarterbacks. They're going to be facing some good teams. I think for anyone that tried to be dismissive of their second half surge, and they were fourth and 12 stop away from making the playoffs, anyone who tried to poo-poo that, you look at this year's schedule and say, man, on paper, they're going to have to earn this thing because there aren't a ton of gimmies on that schedule, and we know how it turns out.
And we all know the Browns are going to be better this year, right?
I think they will be. I mean, I really.
Well, I mean, every year we say that, but one of these years they're going to win 7 or 8 games.
You know what? One of these years, and especially when you have 2 picks in the top 5, at some point, it's almost like the Orioles. You can't be bad forever, and then you make some good decisions. You get some fortunate things happen, and if the Browns find a quarterback, then you start to look at the rest of that roster and say they got some talent. They definitely do, but it's you look at that schedule. You once it finally comes out, start getting some context. You can start planning your road trips. You start seeing what week is the bye, and is that going to be advantageous?
We play in Kansas City this year. You're all excited about that, right? A little barbecue.
Yeah, got to get some got to get some Joe's barbecue, right?
I know that.
That's
that about you.
So we're getting to that point, and before too long, just a couple weeks away now, OTAs actually begin, and we'll start to pretty soon we'll be seeing football players out there in shorts running around. How's that sound?
I talked to a couple of players at the Disney property last Tuesday night. They did a little thing for the media, and a couple of guys that were training down there, a couple kids that play for the Giants and the Saints and some other teams were, talking to me about being locked out of their building. And I know Harbaugh talked about that last week. Yeah. It's really a weird, and I don't know that a lot of fans, Joe Sixpack really understands that, Joe Flacco can't even talk to John Harbaugh this time of year. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean they can have conversations about their kids or something like that, but they're not supposed to talk about any football. And look, we know in reality that some of that does happen, but it really does. This CBA that we're now closer towards the next one than the one that we've been on since 2011. But that's been one of the big things that Harbaugh has talked about, and to me, there needs to be some middle ground, and I think we'll probably see some middle ground at least discussed amidst some of the more contentious issues, seeking more financial issues, when the players and the owners are hammering out the next CBA. But
they haven't done the players any favor by locking them out of their own buildings either.
Yeah,
young players for sure.
I think there needs to be a middle ground where some of this voluntary stuff that we know over the years wasn't treated as actually being voluntary. It needs to actually be voluntary, where there's a case of veteran players like Terrell Suggs or guys like that have been in the league 10 years plus. they don't need to be at the building until mandatory minicamp. Now, it might not be their best interest, but they have that right. Whereas young players who want to be in the building, young players who want to have some more direction, young players who'd like to work with their offensive line coach, because we know offensive line play is so bad around this league right now, you'd like to see some mechanism in place that would allow that to happen.
Well, every guy in the league who isn't starting wants to start or be prepared to start, and there's no better way to do that than to do it in February, March, and April.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's got to be some middle ground that can be established here that isn't going to make, quote, wink, wink, voluntary workouts mandatory. But on the flip side, those guys who actually do want some of that structure in the off season, and we've seen it with young players that they can't be around the facility and they go home and they get in trouble, and we've seen that happen time and time again around this league. There has to be some kind of middle ground there. I don't know what the perfect solution is, but it seems a little silly that an offensive lineman trying to get better going into his third season and knowing that he's playing for another contract, whether in that organization or elsewhere, can't talk to his offensive line coach and can't work out with his offensive line coach in March if he really wants to and wants to get better. To me, there's got to be some kind of a middle ground there that makes sense for both sides.
All right, well, we'll continue our football conversation as also Atlanta is the other road trips. You got Nashville, L.A., Kansas City, Charlotte, and Atlanta for this year's road trips, and a whole bunch of teams like Denver coming in here before it's all over with. Luke's out there at Baltimore Luke on Twitter, as well as Luke at WNST.net. We'll be monitoring all the Astros and Yankees games this week, and anything that happens at the Liars Luncheon, you'll get out on our Twitter on Wednesday as well. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We are together in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. You can listen live anytime you want by downloading the TuneIn radio app. It's all brought to you by buyatoyota.com. Our morning newspaper delivers directly to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Our morning newspaper now features the Maryland Jockey Club entries for Laurel each and every day, getting up onto Pink and Black Eyed Susan and the Preakness. We're now, 6.5 weeks out on all of those festivities, and Justify looking like the favorite for the Kentucky Derby now inside of 4 weeks before we'll run that race. So good times ahead. It's Masters Week around here. Lots and lots and lots going on, all in the morning newspaper, all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Don't forget, any breaking news happens first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And, of course, Dennis Colatzos will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5, driving you home. It is the SSV on WNST, all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.